Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to turn to Dr. Michael Hudson. His current book is The Bubble and Beyond. Dr. Hudson, welcome back to the Keiser Report.
It's good to be here, Max. Thanks for coming to Queens.
I want to talk about a Bloomberg headline. Bloomberg News has a headline warning the sanctions against Russia will hasten the decline of the U.S. dollar in world trade. Now, going back to your career, back in 1972, you published Super Imperialism. It's kind of the textbook of the monetization of the global economy and what this would lead to. It seems like everything you talked about in that book is now happening, the end game, so to speak. Is that a fair statement? What do you think?
Yes, it is. In that book, I showed that the entire balance of payments deficit stemmed from foreign military spending. And the dollars thrown off by military spending end up being put into foreign central banks. So it's really foreign central banks that have financed the U.S. military extension abroad. Yes,
they are rejecting it.
For the first time, there's an alternative.
Right. So just let's talk about this statement here. The sanctions against Russia are going to hasten the decline of the U.S. dollar and world trade. That seems to be the opposite of what it's intended for.
That's the irony. It's the best thing that could have happened to Russia. Finally, now Russia is going to begin protecting its own agriculture and modernizing it. And there's no need for it to import chickens from Arkansas when it can grow its own chickens.
Right. Hasn't it been the case with Russia? They've been overly reliant on Russia, on gas and oil for decades. And when the price is high, they get lazy. They're like, we don't need to diversify because we're getting all this money.
Right.
When the price is low, they panic and we need to drill more. But here, they're forcing them to do something that the U.S., I would think, would not want them to do, diversify.
That's the short-termism of the neocons. And what we're seeing is the end of a whole 60-year cycle. In the 1950s, it was Russia that created the Eurodollar market because it was afraid to put its dollars in U.S. banks.
Wait, let's get back for a second here, because it says that the sanctions against Russia will hasten the decline of the U.S. dollar and world trade. Isn't that the exact opposite of what you would think they were intending?
You'd think so. They're thinking very short term, and they don't realize that Russia has an alternative, and it's as if they drew up this plan to contain Russia and move into the Crimea and block its base before there was the meeting in Brazil last month, where the BRICS got together and created a $100 billion clearing arrangement and a BRICS bank so that they don't have to be dependent on the U.S. dollar. For the first time in 60 years, other countries have an alternative to the dollar. In the 1950s, when Russia had dollars, it couldn't put them in U.S. banks because it was afraid that the banks would grab its money like it grabbed Iran's money. So they put them in London banks, and that created the Eurodollar market, strengthening the dollar. And in 1971, the U.S. dollar was forced off gold, as you've often discussed on this show. But what happened was that there still wasn't an alternative to the dollar, so central banks only had one thing to carry, U.S. Treasury bonds. So it was central banks that funded the balance of payments deficit that really was the military deficit. Well, for the first time, now there's an alternative. The U.S. is not the only country that can create money. Russia, China, the BRICS found they can create electronic money and IOUs just like the U.S. can, and they're very quickly forcing other countries not to use the dollar. And just to help out Russia, Judge Grisa here in New York has blocked Argentina from paying its creditors so that foreign sovereign debtors now cannot issue dollar bonds, because if they issue dollar bonds, somehow they have to go through U.S. banks, and you'll have Judge Grisa's ruling applying to the whole world, treating entire countries like a family restaurant that goes broke and has to distribute all of its assets. So the U.S. is shooting itself in its own foot again and again.
Let's talk about isn't it true that, your background, of course, it came up through banking originally, and so you're very familiar with the whole industry. A couple of questions. If the world goes off a U.S. dollar standard, reserve currency, and it looks like that's what's happening, doesn't that going to make, for Americans anyway, the price of stuff like oil and food, isn't it going to cause inflation because they don't have that privilege that they have, the extraordinary privilege?
In principle, it will. The world won't really go off the dollar standard. It will have a multi-standard world. There will now be a BRICS along with it. The U.S. neoliberals have made sure that the euro cannot create any kind of a euro currency, because in order to create the euro as a backing for central banks, governments would have to run deficits. And the Lisbon Treaty blocks them from creating more than 3% of a deficit. So the U.S. has crippled Europe from ever being part of this, and left only Russia, China, and the BRICS to create an alternative to the dollar. So basically, the U.S. has absorbed Europe into the dollar area. That's going to continue. Whether the currency will go down is still up in the air.
Okay, so let's talk about the Bank of International Settlements for a second. Recently, they issued a stark warning about central banks encouraging global bubbles. They're warning about bubbles now. Are we in a global bubble? What will happen? What can be done to restore? Okay, so is this bubble mentioned by the Bank of International Settlements? Where do you fall on that?
We're in the aftermath of the bubble. The bubble basically burst in 2008 when the junk mortgages went down. And so what happened was you have still banks in negative equity. What we're in is not a bubble, but an attempt by the Federal Reserve and the Treasury to reinflate the bubble, to try to get it back where we were. So the solution to the debt problem is to borrow your way out of debt, to create enough more debt that you can somehow keep the whole bubble that was inflating afloat until the whole system crashes.
Right, so the idea of the bubble bursting in 2008, you had a deflationary event. Essentially, bonds went bust. To reinflate the bubble, they print lots of money. But that has not created the so-called escape velocity. It has not created any real, genuine growth in the economy. So it's been revealed now that this is, in fact, nothing but a global Ponzi scheme, where they have to keep printing and printing and printing to just keep in the same place, because there's no real organic growth, correct?
This is exactly correct. And that's because a Ponzi scheme is an exponential growth of debt. You have to have new members keep joining in enough to pay off the former. The first comers. The problem is that the banks are not lending to real estate because real estate's all loaned up. They're not lending to credit card debt. U.S. debt has actually gone down, and that's because the economy is having to now pay down all of the debts that it was running up under the bubble. So the banks are making a lot of money, but not by lending to the real economy. The banks haven't lent a penny for new capital investment, for new employment, for new research and development. The banks have made their money by arbitrage, by foreign speculation, by essentially corporate buyouts. 1/3 of the American banks' profits in the last quarter came from extending buyout loans for companies to borrow cheap and replace equity with debt. So the debt's going way up for the corporate sector, which now is built into the balance sheet, having to pay off interest. So they're forcing up the cost structure of prices, but the market isn't there. So the result is to put the squeeze on corporations, which usually happens when you have a leveraged buyout.
Yeah, you know, there's this idea of going private. Companies take companies private. Warren Buffett takes Heinz Ketchup private. He's a master at this. He's taken all these companies private. It seems like if there's another crash, Dr. Hudson, someone like Warren Buffett could effectively take America private.
That's the whole idea. When you say take it private, that means take it private on debt. It's a financial process. It means borrow the money to buy out stockholders. So now you're the new owner.
And rates are near 0%, so the cost of this is a fraction.
Well, the cost of creating the money by the banks is 0%, but you can be sure that they charge Warren Buffett and the corporate raiders a much higher price. That's why the bank profits are so high right now. They get the money from the Federal Reserve at 0.1%. They lend it out at 4, 5, or 6% for takeovers. That's their margin. So the bank's balance sheets are being recovered at the expense of the economy. It's a predatory process when you look at the economy-wide effect.
Right now, the 2008 crisis, you know, talking about Warren Buffett for a second, he famously said, when the tide goes out, you see who's not wearing a bathing suit. Now, in 2008, the tide went out, and we saw that Bernie Madoff was not wearing a bathing suit. That Ponzi scheme was exposed, and it went belly up, $80 billion lost, what have you. Given this current scenario where it looks like we're set up for another global crash, what country could be the Bernie Madoff-like moment of reveal in this crisis? Is it China? Is it Japan? They have enormous outstanding debt to GDP. The U.S., Bank of England. Where's the weak link that when the stuff hits the fan this time, who's going to be revealed as the weak link?
Well, First of all, the strongest link is China, because China's central bank is willing to print all the money to keep its economy afloat. So the weak link won't be China. It'll be America, and it's always been America for the last century, because America is the most highly debt leveraged country of all. England is also very severely debt leveraged, which is why the Bank of England has begun to take moves to try to stop the debt leveraging. So the U.S. and England are the weak links, but also you have the sovereign debts, the governments of Southern Europe, Greece, and the other countries that are especially hurt by Russia's retaliatory sanctions. They're still not able to run a budget deficit. So you're having a fiscal squeeze in addition to the debt squeeze. The fiscal squeeze is completely needless. Greece and the Eurozone, of course, could create money, just like the Federal Reserve has done here. But they don't, because that's what neoliberalism does. They've imposed a class war in Europe to sort of tighten the fiscal policy to squeeze down wage rates. So the market is, in terms of the market and government breaking point, Southern Europe is the leading point. In terms of the debt financial breaking point, it'll probably be in the United States from all of these leveraged buyouts. Without a leveraged buyout, a company can always cut back dividends to stockholders if markets turn down. But once there's a leveraged buyout, you can't cut out payments to creditors without declaring bankruptcy and letting the creditors take over. So what we're seeing now is the prospect of a huge property grab by creditors. That's what happens when a bubble bursts.
Well, Dr. Hudson, thanks so much again for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you very much, Max.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacey Hebert. I'd like to thank our guest, Dr. Michael Hudson. His latest book is called The Bubble and Beyond. If you'd like to tweet us at Keiser Report. Until next time, Max Keiser saying, bye, y'all.